So sorry that this is running into more than one 15-minute spot. I'm going to try to move quickly for you. So FDR declares a bank holiday in which he closes the banks, reorganizes them. Some of them are closed for good, and some of them are opened and strengthened. And think about this. You can't have access to your money. The banks are closed. It's the middle of the Great Depression. FDR used these things called fireside chats that you've probably heard of, where he speaks to the American people. You hear the crackling of the fire behind him, and he really gives support to America and helps to alleviate their fears. He's an incredibly charismatic, great speaker, and like I said, I find it so interesting that Herbert Hoover says a chicken in every pot, and everyone gets angry. FDR says the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and people are inspired. There's just something that some people have, and FDR certainly was a charismatic politician. Recovery. Well, look at this alphabet administration. There's so many programs, and believe it or not, I'm editing. I'm really trying to give you just a handful to give you an idea of what to study. So the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. The National Recovery Administration, whose symbol was the Blue Eagle. Interestingly enough, there was a football team in Philadelphia that started around this time, and they were looking for a good name. Guess what they called themselves? The Eagles. You might say, but the Eagles are green. Why weren't they blue? They used to be blue, which is, I don't know how fascinating that is, but I find it to be kind of interesting, especially being a Giant fan. So the NRA, I scream out at games, your program is based on a failed FDR economic program. No, all right, I'm just joking. I'll move forward. The NRA was a program by FDR that tried to help the economy by setting limits of production and standardization of wages. It will later be declared unconstitutional. You know, it's essentially you could join the NRA, and if you join the NRA, today we think of the Rifle Association, of course, but I'm talking about obviously the New Deal program. If you join the NRA, you would get certain benefits from the federal government, but you had to abide by their restrictions, both in terms of how much you could produce and how much you could pay your workers. And this was seen as having too much of an influence on the economy. Similarly, the Agricultural Adjustment Act provided was also declared unconstitutional and also provided criteria for prices and production for farmers. And it was designed to help rise prices by limiting production and a degree of command economy. The Public Works Administration, when we talk about prime pump, we're putting Americans to work, and FDR's PWA built a tremendous amount of public works programs. Probably the most famous is the Grand Coulee Dam down here, but it's almost, it's hard to drive through a town and not see an old New Deal building if you know what you're looking for. And I'll show you some pictures later. There were literally thousands and thousands of city halls built, schools built, dams built, roads built. It was the idea of putting America to work and not only benefiting by giving people a paycheck, but then, of course, you have a dam, you have a road, you have a school. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a program in which they really targeted a particular area, and a tremendous amount of government spending and programs were put into this one area, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Many dams, electricity, roads, government support of business and industry there. It was really an experiment to see if the federal government could revitalize a particular area. It's the Great Depression. Maybe they can't fix everywhere, but can they fix the Tennessee Valley? This is all part of FDR's recovery programs, and some pictures here. So the PWA, Public Works Administration, there's a good example of a PWA building. You know, they're around. If you see a building that was built in the late 30s, chances are it was a Public Works Administration building. And then there were the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which provided money for writers and artists. And, this is a particularly visual example of the WPA. But my favorite WPA program, which comes up on the AP every once in a while in the form of documents, is that they paid writers to go to the South. This is the 1930s. We're 60, 70 years removed from slavery. So there were actually a few people who were still alive who were slaves, and it sent writers to go and interview them. And this writers project was incredibly beneficial to historians to have kind of that living history. Well, as I said earlier, some of FDR's programs were declared unconstitutional. This is Charles Evans Hughes. He was the Supreme Court Chief Justice at the time. As you can see, this cartoon is a pretty good resemblance of him. And mainly, many of these appointees were Republican appointees. I believe he was appointed by Hoover and others by Coolidge and still others by Harding. These were conservatives who declared the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the NRA Act, unconstitutional. Great cartoon about, you know, the role that the Supreme Court played in putting the brakes on the New Deal. You know, the New Deal is a lot of radical, seen by some as radical legislation. Whether you support it or you don't support it, you like it or you don't like it, it certainly was a major change in American government. And Charles Evans Hughes, as a member of the Supreme Court, really put the brakes on it by declaring these laws unconstitutional. FDR comes up with this thing called the court packing scheme. Now, the court packing scheme is fairly complicated in its design. For every judge that was over a certain age, another judge would be appointed to help that judge, you know, because these judges are old. You know, why else would they declare FDR's legislation to be unconstitutional? And essentially, most people saw this to be as a way of FDR trying to subvert or go around the Supreme Court. And I love this story because whether you support it or you don't support it, whatever, I love the idea that FDR was incredibly popular, but this policy was not. And regardless of his popularity, this was seen for what most people see it as an attempt to sidestep the policy or the institution of checks and balances. So despite his immense popularity, FDR, and despite him being able to pass all of these laws and legislation and amendments, FDR is not able to get the court packing scheme through. Coincidentally, many Supreme Court judges retire, a few die, and FDR is able to get many of his judges into the Supreme Court, and very few laws will be passed after this incident. But nonetheless, a really important incident during FDR's presidency. Reform. FDR, so relief, we're going to provide for the poor. Recover, we're going to get back on our feet. Reform, we're going to make it so it never happens again. I'm making this presentation, obviously, and I'm looking for a good cartoon for you, and I just thought this was such an interesting cartoon regarding, obviously, a negative view. Cartoons are editorials, so please don't think I am saying that this is true, but this is a negative view of FDR's Social Security and FDR's programs in general. So who was hit hardest by the Great Depression? You know, go back to that cartoon of the man on the beach. The man on the beach, that's a Freudian slip. The man on the bench. And the idea that, by Freudian slip, I mean, I would like to be on the beach right now. That the man on the bench who had lost everything, you know, he can go back to work. He's a fairly young looking guy. But what about the older gentleman who's lost everything? What about the person who's over 65? What is that guy going to do? So many people during this time period believed that the elderly should get some type of government help to help them through. Social Security is going to be one of the most landmark laws in American history. It's sometimes referred to as the third rail of American politics because if you don't want to touch it because it's very popular. But it is one of the biggest government programs. As people live longer, Social Security costs more and more, and there are some people who believe that Social Security needs to be reformed, or the United States government won't be able to afford it. And this goes back to the whole Keynesian economics idea. Very, very important as we move forward, both in American history and through American society. Securities Exchange Commission was put in place to regulate the stock market. Joseph Kennedy, you might remember that famous story of Joseph Kennedy being told by a shoeshine boy that he's going to get into the stock market, and Joseph Kennedy, wary of this exuberance, decides to sell all of his stocks. Many people believe that Joseph Kennedy perhaps had some inside information, that Joseph Kennedy was engaged in something that today we might call insider trading. And when Joseph Kennedy is put into charge of the Securities Exchange Committee, one of FDR's closest aides allegedly said, how could you put Kennedy in charge? It's like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. And FDR reputedly said, that's why I'm putting him there, because he knows all the tricks. So the Securities Exchange Commission is designed to regulate the stock market and make sure that the stock market would not engage in dangerous practices that could lead to a Great Depression. Some people say that the Securities Exchange Commission has fallen down on the job in recent years. We might think of Bernie Madoff. We might think of some of the scandals that have been talked about in regards to the recent recession. This was an era, though, when we talk about this and we say, wow, Social Security and government jobs and all of this, that this was an era of liberal extremism by FDR. Going back to another idea that we've talked about, some would say that this was actually a conservative approach to forestall greater extremism. So there are these two people who probably illustrate this the best. One is Huey Long. Huey Long was a Louisiana politician who was larger than life, who had a policy called Share Our Wealth, and had a song that went with it called Every Man a King. And the idea was very radical, that there'd be limits on wealth in this country, there'd be limits on salaries for the wealthy, that every family would be provided with a stipend to a degree that would be at least 1/3 of the average family's wealth. So this was extremism. Dr. Townsend's plan was that every older person would be provided with the degree of money, and of course Social Security starts to model this. So Huey Long is eventually assassinated, but he's a great what if in American history. A lot of people think that it's during times of great economic crisis that the greatest political and social changes often occur. And just a little bit of a more analytical way of looking at FDR. You can look at him any way that you want, but one way to think about him that is interesting is that perhaps some of his ideas were more conservative in regards to the extremism of the time. And last but not least, what ended the Great Depression? What a great debate, And when you go and you look at charts, you can find people who believe that the New Deal didn't end Great Depression. And you can find charts like this, where it shows that you have the stock market crash and unemployment, and FDR's New Deal takes over. And although FDR's New Deal does put people to work, this chart illustrates, or certainly the group that made this chart is trying to illustrate, that it didn't do enough, and that really it was World War II that ended the Great Depression, certainly not the New Deal. And there's a debate for that. The other side of that debate is that the New Deal was actually too small, that the government didn't do enough, and it was the huge increase in spending of World War II that ended the Great Depression. And it's not that the New Deal wasn't right in philosophy, it's that the New Deal was actually too small. Now, as I often say, I don't care what you believe. I think you should believe whatever you want. But I find the disagreement here, I find the different interpretation here to be very interesting. So the idea that the increased government spending of the New Deal really didn't do enough to end the Great Depression has implications for today. Should we have government spending on things like healthcare or whatever controversial idea that you want to bring up? Conversely, should we spend more? Is the government not doing enough? And that's why, to go back to the first slide, that's one of the major reasons that the New Deal is a big deal, because the New Deal hasn't gone away. Essentially, it's a part of our political discourse and debate today. So I'm so sorry this took me so much longer than I had hoped. It is an important topic. I still hope you have a great break and that this doesn't detract too much from it.